So hello everyone, and thanks for attending this interview. We are absolutely delighted to have you both here, Professor Visser and Fabio Perovich. First, a quick disclaimer. This interview will be carried out in English because we have a lot of guests here that speaks English. Afterwards, we will prepare an edit video with subtitles and upload it in our YouTube channel. Stay connected. Let's see a little bit of the bios of our guests. So Professor Wayne Visser is Professor of Integrated Value and holder of the chair in Sustainable Transformation at Antwerp Management School. He's also founder of CSR International, Director of Kaleidoscope Futures, and Fellow at University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. He describes himself as a professional idea monger, storyteller, and meme weaver. His work as a strategy analyst, sustainability advisor, CSR expert, futurist, film producer, and professional speaker has taken him to 77 countries in the past 30 years to work with 150 clients, ranging from Coca-Cola, Dell, DHL, HSBC, to the United Nations Environmental Programme and the World Bank. He also came to Brazil last time in 2010. Fabio Perovich, CFA, graduated in Business Administration, Getúlio Vargas Foundation, with extension courses at University of California, Berkeley, and Harvard Kennedy School. He started his career at Procter & Gamble. He founded Fama Investimentos in 1993, where he is responsible for managing the equity fund of Brazilian companies, focused on companies with social responsibility and adhering to ESG practices. Fama Investimentos is a B Corp. In the third sector, he was the founder and director of the following NGOs: Fama Institute, Brazil-Israel Institute, Totos da Tete Institute. He's a board member to WWF Brazil, GRI Brazil, Conscious Capitalism Brazil, and the Jewish Museum of São Paulo. He's also a member of the TNFD working group. He was a member of the board of directors of several publicly traded companies and a CFA chartered holder. I would like also to show a lot of the books that Professor Wayne has written over time. He's author of dozens of books in corporate responsibility, sustainability, but he's also a great poet. Next, please. This is some of the covers of his books. And he's also a filmmaker. He produced the first documentary in the world about circular economy. I would like to show, for those that haven't seen yet, the trailer of the film.
I don't think we're getting audio.
Tá sem som. Teste que a gente fez não funciona. Deu errado?
Unless we go to circular, it's game over for the planet. It's game over for society.
We don't have a choice but to do this. This is imperative for our survival.
So if we really don't change our mindset, I think it will be the end of the world.
We're moving from a world of 7 billion people on the planet to 9 billion.
The way we're existing right now on planet Earth, this biosphere is really being driven by humans who are parasites.
If you look at how much plastic pollution is accumulating in the ocean, that plastic is starting to accumulate in the fish that people eat.
There's not a lot of stuff left. And the stuff that we've got to protect, and we've got to care for, and we've got to use efficiently. It's not utopia, it's necessity.
I am frightened that my generation will be the first generation in the world which will leave my children and grandchildren an earth which they might never be able to fix.
Whether it takes 20 years or 50 years or 100 years, it is inevitable that we will hit those limits. We'll run out of resources, or the pollution will become so bad that it affects our human health and we start to feel the impact as human beings.
I think if we continue with the linear economy, we're, to use a technical term, totally screwed.
Yes, that's right. We have the film with subtitles in Portuguese, Professor Wayne just wrote here in the chat. Professor Wayne and Fabio, I would like to share with our audience why I had the idea to bring the two of you together for this interview. ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is in the basis of economic results and impacts within short and long term of companies. Since the BIS report, Green Swans, central banking and financial stability in the age of climate change, there has been an avalanche of warnings on the climate crisis, impacts on finances, and there is an urgency for investors to consider social and environmental impacts in financial analysis of companies as financial risks. At the same time, there was an overwhelming quantity of ESG metrics and scores trying to facilitate the job of the analysts in translating the company's status on ESG. But in my view, this is not so simple. We still see greed above corporate responsibility. So that's the reason for bringing the two of you together here for our audience. It's a great honor to have you both here. Thanks, Professor Wayne, and thanks, Fabio, for opening the time in your busy schedule to answer some of our questions. So let's get started with some questions. And also, I greatly appreciate the questions that some of you so kindly sent beforehand. We will try to answer them now at the end. In one of Professor Wayne's episodes of the podcast series Purpose Inspired, published during last Christmas about one of your books, The Quest for Sustainable Business, an epic journey in search of corporate responsibility, you say that there has been 20 years now that you work in the field of CSR. After all the business that you have done and researched all around the globe, is it possible to still keep an optimistic view that the majority of business will have the purpose of being responsible in implementing a governance that could be effective, environmental, and social, and on top of that, being accountable for all the costs and impacts that they cause? Professor Wayne, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all today. I'm glad this worked out. And since that comment was written, I guess 10 years have gone by, because it's been more than 30 years now that I've been involved in this agenda. And I think there's good news and bad news. The good news is that sustainability is much higher up the agenda than it was 30 years ago. When I started, it was something on the side. I had to really look for news on what companies might be doing on social or environmental issues. And now it is mainstream. That's not to say that a sustainable future is guaranteed, because there's still the question of how deep these changes go. I think that there will be winners and losers. So not all companies will survive this transition, and those that have been more forward-thinking and taken bolder action will be the ones that thrive in a more sustainable future. I have no doubt that we will move significantly now towards a better, more environmentally and socially sustainable future. It's happening quite fast now, but not everybody will survive the transition.
Excellent, Professor Wayne, thank you. That's right, that's more than 30 years now that you work in this field. So Fabio, could you give us your view about your optimism looking at the companies in Brazil?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for the invitation. And I hope everyone is safe and healthy in these difficult times. I wouldn't say that I'm very optimistic, despite the fact that ESG is quite old. For Brazilians, it looks like very new. It's in the mainstream and everybody's talking about ESG. And we still see a lot of greenwashing and companies, asset managers and other actors trying to sell an image that is not realigned to the fundamentals of ESG. And in this sense, I'm not very optimistic, because we as Brazilians, we are not taking all the actions that we should be taking right now. On the other hand, I'm very optimistic because we are in the middle of a big change. The generation is changing, and those who belong to the new generation, they have the fundamentals of ESG into their DNA. So it's very relevant for them to fight against environmental issues or racism or other social issues. So as the time passes, these guys are going to be relevant consumers, they'll be inheriting portfolios and to be invested aligned to their ideals, and also going to the public policies and so on and so forth. So in the long run, I'm a bit more optimistic. In the short term in Brazil, I'm not that optimistic right now. We are flooded with the greenwashing. On the other hand, I see more and more people changing their habits and concerns with everything that's happening in the media, and the awareness is higher.
Thanks, Fabio. And we hope that this came as a strong change, transformation. So let's move on to the second question. In one of Professor Wayne's books, he quotes Mahatma Gandhi: "The earth has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed." Also, Professor Wayne it's a very creative user of metaphors. So I'm mentioning it because I will mention one of the metaphors that he used for the businesses that fails to distinguish the long-term effects of gradual changes. He compares it to the boiled frog syndrome. It's a very creepy sensation because you don't feel that you are dying. It happens with some industries in the past. So my question is, Professor Wayne, do you think that the age of greed and boiled frogs are diminishing over the years with the awareness of climate change, planet overshoot, social inequalities, and more regulation from the governments, investors' pressure, and customers' better choices? Or do we still have hidden greed business under a green, beautiful vest and makeup?
It's a good question. I think what's happening is we are going through a transition, and when that happens, you get resistance to change, and you get many which hold on to the old ways of doing things. And the old ways include that model of greed. It includes many of the conservative values, these selfish values actually that we've just seen manifest in the Trump administration, and we see it in other political scenes as well. But these are like the dying throes of an old age. And so there are certainly companies and whole countries that are still caught in that greed mindset. But what we see is culturally, there is a shift that is taking place. If you look, for example, at the Business Roundtable with their Purpose of Corporations statement that was signed by 181 of the world's largest company CEOs. Now, they may not be there yet, but at least they're signaling that it's now important to be pursuing stakeholder capitalism. We see that in the World Economic Forum with their Davos manifesto, same thing. The rhetoric, at least, the public statements are that we have to shift away and we no longer want to be associated with this narrow-minded, shareholder-driven, short-term capitalism. Now, it hasn't all changed yet, but the signals are there. And I think that the pioneering companies are the ones showing us that this is a better way. There's research from McKinsey and Company that shows actually that even economically, the companies with a longer term perspective perform better. They perform better on earnings, on capital performance, and so on. So, you know, it's a confusing time. It's a battle, actually. We have to see it like that. It's a war going on, and it's a war between the past and the future. And those that are benefiting from the status quo will do everything in their power in the same way that Trump did everything he could to hold on to power. So will many companies that were benefiting from that very narrow financial greed focus. But they're creatures of yesterday. Will be the dinosaurs of tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Professor Wayne. A war between the past and the future, that's right. That's a very interesting view. So Fabio, could you give us some examples of business that are currently in the boiled frog syndrome status, perhaps not aware of their status or insisting in business as usual profits?
I like the expression, the dinosaurs of the future. It makes all sense. And I think that it's very easy to say that fossil fuels is one of those, but it's not only that. And these are the obvious businesses that are in risk. But I think that it's not about the sector, but it's about the culture. Companies that are not thinking in their stakeholders as a whole and have an holistic view and to be managed, these businesses are going to disappear in the future because all the competitors are going to take a lot of advantage, and they are going to be able to hire the best people. They're going to be able to keep the people there, and the consumers, they have a very strong relationship with the company because they respect the environment, they respect people, and so on and so forth. So they by doing that, they create like a loyalty and a fidelity from the consumers, the relationship and all the value chain, not only the consumers but the employees and the suppliers. So I believe that we have to stop thinking about sectors, and we should start thinking about the culture. And regardless of the sectors, companies are in danger if they don't change the way they are managed. They have to think about the stakeholders rather than thinking only in the shareholders. So this is the major change, I believe, for the future. Those who are not in this path, they are going to be the dinosaurs of the future.
Thank you, Fabio. It's very interesting. It's all about culture, not only the sector of the economy, and paying attention for all the stakeholders. That's right. Thank you, both of you. So, Professor Wayne, next question. How can boards and executives fight the short-termism and the quarterly profits and see value in pursuing the long-term goals of sustainability? Is this a case of lack of purpose and strategic long-term view in its culture values, like Fabio told?
Well, I think that partly it's the fault of business schools that have been teaching this shareholder-driven capitalism for many years. That has been changing in the last 5 to 10 years. And today that's far less strong. So we're still seeing the effects of what was being taught on MBA programs in the 1980s and onwards. And I think that's where it has to start. It has to start with a different education for future leaders. And then what you need is a different set of incentives on the financial markets. I mean, this is the main reason, of course, for short-termism is the financial analysts and the way that stock markets work are extremely short-term. Quarterly or even daily fluctuations in share prices are cause for huge pressure on companies and their leaders. And there's something very structural that has to change there to give less power to those shareholders and those markets. And I think part of the solution, although it's a really difficult problem to solve, and I'll be interested to hear Fabio's take, but at least for the large companies that are able to take a leadership position on sustainability, they can resist that pressure from the market. So you get Unilever under their former CEO, Paul Polman, refusing to report quarterly because it creates the wrong kind of incentive and behavior. You get Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in the world, very successful investor, saying that you should invest so that it's as if the company will be in place for 100 years. You won't be able to withdraw your investment. And so you really need to look at the long-term perspective. We're definitely not there yet. Many companies feel this immense pressure. CEOs are often not in place for more than 3 years, but the best of them are signaling to the market through long-term strategic plans. And in this case, long-term usually only stretches to 10 years, but we have targets reaching to 2050 now with the Paris Climate Agreement and so on, that this really is about long-term value creation. But this is a really difficult one for companies and their leaders.
That's right. So look at the long-term perspective. It's a very good challenge for the companies. So Fabio, could you tell us how frequent do you see this happening in Brazilian companies that auto-declares themselves being sustainable, but still pursue quarterly profits?
Sorry, your audio was cut at the end of the question. Can you repeat, please? How often?
How often? How frequent do you see happening in Brazilian companies that auto-declare themselves being sustainable, but still pursue quarterly profits?
Okay, it's interesting because up to, let's say, the beginning of 2020, companies were not concerned about declaring themselves as sustainable. When they were doing that, they were just talking with their employees and customers and suppliers. They were not talking to the financial market, because the financial market, at least in Brazil, were not interested at that time to check if the company was sustainable or not. It was not making any difference from them. So the sustainability report or the integrated report was not a piece of reading for the financial analysts. It was not meaningful for them. But it changed. So now companies that are seen as sustainable, they deserve richer valuations, and companies that are not seen as sustainable, they are deleted from some portfolios. So companies are making a great effort right now to declare themselves as sustainable. The problem is that, so they have an intention and they have all the information, so they control the narrative. The problem is that the financial community in Brazil have not discussed human rights or environmental issues for, let's say, 20 or 30 years. So those are very complex subjects. And as of now, we are very, very shallow. So all the environmental issues, we are only focusing on carbon emissions, and all the social issues, we are focusing only on gender equality. It's not about that. So of course, those items are very relevant, but I wouldn't say that companies that are not making high emissions of CO2 are environmental responsible. It's not about that. So I think that as of now, companies say a lot, but do a little. And the financial community cannot discuss that because the debate was not happening so far. So I believe that it's going to take 2 or 3 years at least for those concepts that are very complex to be understood by the financial community. And so we'll have something to really make some progressions, and the investors will make engagements to really develop the procedures of the companies.
Thanks, Fabio. You are so right. I was talking to a director of sustainability of a company that's in the sustainability index of our B3s, how can I say in English, our Bolsa, help me, Fabio.
Stock exchange.
Yes, our stock exchange. And he said that when he is with the financial community in meetings, they come unprepared to the meetings. They don't read the reports. They don't know what the company are doing with the ESG detailed. So it's terrible. I know what you were saying. The financial community needs profound knowledge. So thank you so much. Professor Wayne, in the book, The Age of Responsibility, I have here, and I need your autograph someday. CSR 2.0 is the new DNA of business. I would like to quote an extract about greenwashing. Fabio just mentioned about greenwashing. Was all about hype and appearance rather than honesty and action. And too many firms simply sought corporate responsibility window dressing to help them look better in an increasingly informed world. They released fancy reports with pretty pictures. They had their CEOs photographed at CR conference and summits. But very rarely did they walk their talk. Professor Wayne, do you think that this could still be happening today, 10 years after the book was published?
For sure, it's still happening. Not only greenwashing, but now with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, with all of their colorful icons, I call that rainbow washing that's happening now. That will probably always be with us. But what I would say is that it's getting much more difficult to greenwash. The stakeholders are getting far more informed. There are standards that allow us to check how deep and how far companies go. There are targets. I mean, to Fabio's point, I agree that sometimes the sustainability agenda gets narrowed to one or two issues like climate change and gender, and we need it to be more holistic, covering more issues. But I would also say that a company that doesn't have a science-based target on carbon cannot in any way claim to be a sustainable company. I mean, that is just the reality of one of the issues, one of the most important, which is climate change, is that we have to get to net zero carbon by 2050, probably a lot earlier, actually. So I just think that we have far more tools and standards and information and education to really scrutinize companies and to make a judgment on that. I also think that the market actually is getting far more sophisticated. So when you get Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, doing his annual letter to his CEOs and to his clients, I mean, he's very, very clear in the last 3 years that they're interested in long-term value creation, and that if companies are not tackling not only climate risk, but certainly climate risk, they will get disinvested from. And already they've done a ban on companies that are invested in thermal coal. If you look at a company like BP, last year it had to write down $17.5 billion. And that's because the market is starting to recognize. If you look at a company in contrast like Tesla, right, it's valued at more than all of the other car companies put together, and it makes 100 times less cars than just General Motors. That's because the market is looking to what the future will require. So I think that it's harder to greenwash now. It still happens, but it's not as easy as it used to be.
Yes, thank you. I agree with you. Long-term value creation. That's what we need. That's what we need. But we still have a lot of rainbow washing. Talking about walk the talk, Fabio, you as a fund manager, how could you identify companies that uses greenwashing in Brazil even today?
Our approach to ESG is a bit different from the usual. We don't believe in KPIs, only KPIs. We think that ESG is more qualitative rather than quantitative. So, and we understand that ESG is more related to the decision making in all aspects and all departments of a company. So in order to have an holistic view about a company, it takes a lot of time because we have to talk to several people, not only in the organization, but also different stakeholders. So we have to speak to suppliers, associations, consumers, employees of different levels, and it takes a lot of time. So honestly, I wouldn't be able to say if a company is aligned to ESG principles or not, just based on indicators or KPIs. It's very difficult for me. Our approach is totally different. So it takes a lot of time. And through this very thorough process, it's very easy to cross-check information. And if you speak only to the IR department or to CEO or C-level, they're very well trained, not only trained, but they're very used to speak with investors, and they know what investors want to hear. But when we're speaking with different stakeholders, the truth come up. So we believe that it's as I said before, it's very complex, and no company is perfect, and we come across with a lot of flaws and gaps, and it's normal. So we compare our materiality matrix with our findings in the research process, and so we invest in companies that we believe that at least have a culture that are aligned to the ESG standards. And so, if necessary, we engage with the companies to improve their procedures. So we may invest in companies that are, let's say, in state of the art of ESG, and also we invest in companies that are not in state of the art, but they want to make this journey. And so we help the companies. We do not invest in companies that have, so as I said before, ESG is very complex, it's not binary, but we believe that ethics is something binary. So we cannot invest in companies that have no ethics. And ethics, in our point of view, is related not only to the financial issues, but also human rights and environmental issues. So companies that have no ethics, we don't invest at all. Companies that don't believe that ESG is a way to create value, we don't invest. But we do invest in companies that are in the beginning of the journey, and so we help those companies. But it takes a lot of time in order to have an opinion.
Thank you, Fabio. It's very interesting, this kind of thought, and also your view that take a lot of time, effort to analyze a company. It's not that easy. Thank you so much. So next question, Professor Wayne. It's how can we, given what we were talking before, see that ESG is integrated into business strategy? How can we see that this is happening? What will be the signs?
Yeah, I have a simple test for this, and then of course it gets more complicated, but the simple test, I call it the test of admission and ambition. Admission is, do the companies, through their communications, admit how serious the problems are that we face, how urgent they are, and that the current economic model, including their companies, are part of the problem. If a company is not doing that already, I think they're probably not doing genuine sustainability. The second half is ambition. How bold are the strategic goals that they're setting? This is where a lot of companies still get away with appearing to be sustainable when really they're, we have an English saying, they're shifting deck chairs on the Titanic. I mean, or playing music in the orchestra on the Titanic. They're not making any real change, because it doesn't help these days to have a target that I'm going to reduce waste by 5% or I'm going to reduce carbon by 3%. I mean, what we're looking for are companies that are willing to transform, to get to net zero carbon, to get to a fully circular economy, to get to 100% renewable energy, to get to complete gender equality and other forms of diversity. There are many measures now where you can really be bold and ambitious because we're not making enough progress. So that's the simple way to test. And I think you can go into more detail. We have a methodology. We use a 7-step methodology where we look at different levels of integration. There's integration into their thinking. It starts with that. So are they analyzing the system that they're part of? Then there's integration in terms of stakeholders. Have they talked to, listened to their stakeholders? Then there's integration in terms of their values. And this is not just the values they put on their report. It's actually how do they treat each other? What is the culture of the company? There's integration at the level of strategic objectives, then at the level of performance measures, KPIs, then in the dimension of innovation. Again, to do a test, you can take any company's product portfolio and you can categorize those products as to whether they're part of the problem or part of the solution. Are they accelerating our change to a sustainable society, or are they actually slowing us down? Or are they in the middle? So the innovation dimension, and then the final one is integration into their lobbying activities, because a lot of companies will have sustainability departments, reports, managers who say and do all the right things. And then another part of the company, usually through their business associations, will be lobbying against sustainability legislation, progressive change. And so there needs to be integration at that level as well.
This could be another event just to listen to you in these 7 steps. Thank you so much, Professor Wayne. So I like when you say, how bold are the strategic goals? I think that's a good way to test a company. And I constantly see in Fabio's posts in LinkedIn, he's saying about the companies, they put a goal that's not so bold. So that's not making, going to make a difference. And so Fabio, on top of that, could you give us some examples of ESG integrated into business strategy in Brazil?
Yes, several. I think that just to make an answer it's not usual, because in Brazil, when we speak about ESG, everyone thinks about something green or renewable energy and something like that. It's more impact. So of course it could be ESG as well. So I'd like to make an example of companies that are not very clear for everybody that are linked to ESG, but they are. One example that I like a lot is Renner, which is for Professor Wayne, probably he is not aware about this company, but he's an apparel retailer in Brazil. And the apparel retailing is not a sector that is linked to ESG or impact. The opposite. I would say that it's a very complicated sector, because all the problems they have with the textile chain and so on and so forth. But this company is totally into the ESG. The culture is totally ESG, and I would like to share an example. So in February or in the beginning of March, I'm not sure, of 2020, when the pandemic was growing very quickly in Brazil, and we didn't have the lockdowns from the mayors or the governors. So Loja Senior made a statement, and this statement was comprised of two parts. The part number one, they were saying that from that day onwards, the stores would be closed. And now it's easier to understand how a store decides to close their doors, but they were the first to do that. So they decided, and I don't know how they the decision making process was, from one day to another, the sales to go to zero. So it's very complicated because it's very easy to be sustainable when there is no dilemma. So that day they decided to have no sales at all. And not only that, the part number two of their statement was that employees, don't panic because we are not firing anyone. So your jobs are guaranteed. And at the end, they were saying also, making a message to the suppliers and saying, well, we are going to privilege the local suppliers rather than the global suppliers. So with that statement, they were making a story in my history, in my point of view. Why? Because they didn't have time to decide. The pandemic at that time was escalating very quickly. And in governance, I was a board member for several companies. It's the regular process is that the CEO make a project and takes a lot of time, and they call a board member meeting and they present the results and the returns, so on and so forth. It takes a lot of time. So they made this statement just because it was impossible for the culture to have the stores opened while there was a pandemic. So they had to protect the employees, they had to protect their customers. So it's very serious. There's very serious. And also there's a stakeholder capitalism there, because they were considering the panic of their employees, because if they were announcing only the shutdown of the stores, what their employees would think? Well, the stores are closed. I'm going to lose my job, and I'll have a problem to feed my children here. So what I'm going to do? And so they were considering not only the health of their employees, but also the mental health and preserving jobs and so on and so forth, and also their suppliers. So it's a beautiful example of a company that is not related to a sector that belongs to the common sense of ESG, but a company that thinks about all the stakeholders and very quickly. So it's embedded in their culture.
Thanks, Fabio, for the very good example. I love also the Henner company. I will send after the link for the company to Professor Wayne. So we have little time left. So I just went forward here to two more questions, and then we go to the questions from the audience. According to Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of United Nations, taking into account that we are in the decade to deliver, 75% of global GDP comes from the private sector. And so the CEOs must fight climate change, meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and eradicate poverty by 2030. And we are not on track for this. Despite these urgent credentials needed from boards and CEOs to the task, a recent article from the NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business mentioned a serious research showed that only 10% of ESG issues are regularly reviewed by the board meetings. According to to Larry Fink's last letter that was just released, he told that purpose is the engine of long-term profitability. So I'm telling this because we need the CEOs and the board on board to take this big ship, not the Titanic, Professor Wayne, to make the transformations. So the question is, if the company's purpose is able to stimulate systematic corporate responsibility and sustainability through innovating process, products, and services, do you think that the main responsibility for defining and creating the culture belongs to the board and C-level? The walk the talks examples still remain a board and C-level responsibility for this to happen?
Thanks for the question, and I unfortunately will have to leave in 5 minutes, but look, leadership has a very important role to play. I do think that we can't imagine that business will solve these big challenges on their own, so we need cross-sector partnerships more than ever. Business needs to be working together with government, together with NGOs. And I would say as well that I always think in terms of complex living systems, and when you look at how things change there, it's often not top-down change, it's often bottom-up. So it helps to have a common goal, and that's why the strategic goals are really important. Even the SDGs are important. If people are clear of where we need to move to, you don't necessarily need those board members to be instructing people. So you can have it coming from within organizations, from employees at all different levels. And very importantly, I think for some of these big changes, we need mass movements again. We need a cultural shift. We do need people on the streets. We need people going on climate strikes or Black Lives Matter or whatever the issues are. We need people to be joining together as civil society. That will put pressure on the boards, on the leaders, and in turn, they will change. Just to mention, I mean, I lived through the South African transition from a racist apartheid system to democracy. And for 40 years, those in power, the white minority, fought to keep that system in place. And they fought right until the end. And then when it changed, after all the pressure from many, many different directions, then it changed very, very quickly. Within a few years, it changed. And then suddenly all of those people who were resisting flipped, and their perspective was quite different. Now, because most of us in a big system like society or organizations, we are followers, we're not leaders. So as soon as the values change and the norms of society, the expectations of stakeholders change, in fact, you'll find that the leaders, including those on the board, are not leaders at all. They're just followers. They want to be in touch with what is moving in society, what is changing, what is expected in society. So very important, I think, not to only look to the board, but of course, if you've got strong leadership from the top, it helps. It makes it easier to make that switch.
Thanks, Professor Wayne. I'll just ask the question to Fabio, and then we are going to close going to the end of the event. Fabio, how engaged do you think the investors are in demanding this corporate responsibility from their invested companies? Do you think are any difference between the local and foreign investors?
Yes, and I don't blame blame them about this difference because, as I said, this is a new environment for Brazilians, and we have some difficulties here because the main benchmark, which is the Bovespa index, is comprised of very controversial businesses, as Petrobras, which is fossil fuel, Vale, which has had a very terrible past, and JBS as well. So those companies together represent 25% of the index. It's not a problem for me to be away from the index and the tracking error being high. It's not a problem. For most of the Brazilian funds, it's a problem. So I think it's going to take some time for Brazilians to get rid of those complicated companies and to engage with the companies to be more than how much CO2 you're responsible in the planet, and what's the gender equality. So questions and engagements should be more than that, and it takes more time. So I think that we are just starting, and transparency is very important. So, and it's very important to bear in mind that the ownership of Brazilian companies is a bit different. So proxy voting is not the main strategy in my point of view in Brazil, because most of companies here have a defined control. So the engagements should be at the board level and mainly with the controlling groups. And it's not a proxy fighting, and we believe that general shareholders meeting is not the best place to engage. We believe that conversations with companies should make more effect.
Thank you, Fabio. Professor Wayne, Visser, Fabio, thank you so much for your time and all your knowledge shared with us today. We wish that we could remain here more, but we know that your time is very valuable. And I would like to say to our audience that all the questions, we will receive it by email, and we will answer to you by email, because we didn't have time, unfortunately. We also had some questions even from the interview that we couldn't ask, but I think everybody could learn a lot from this hour, from you, Professor Wayne, and from you, Fabio. Professor Wayne, do you want to say your last words?
Only to thank you and to apologize that we didn't get to all the questions. I know you invited me, I think, to give a kind of a presentation, and I said I preferred this format, which is rather to have a conversation with you. Lovely that Fabio could join as well and give us that detailed and context-specific perspective. So always a pleasure to engage. I hope I find a good reason to visit Brazil again soon. I'm hoping actually to do another film called Regeneration, which is also the subject of my next book, which should be out in a few months. And if I do that film, I'll probably do a world lecture tour, and I hope that I'll be able to visit you in Brazil.
It will be a pleasure, Professor Wayne. Let's talk about it. Thank you so much for having you. Thank you. Fabio, do you want to say something?
It was a great pleasure for me to exchange ideas with Professor Visser. Thank you, Daniela, to setting up this event, and I hope it was very good for the audience, and I'm totally open for more questions wherever they are. So thank you very much.
So thank you, and see you in the next opportunity. Bye-bye. Thank you all.